There's some really, really great work going on across the museum field around accessibility, particularly intersectional accessibility, where we really are layering in folks that are disabled and also Black or brown or et cetera. And so just having that intersection is important.
Welcome to an interview episode of Tech in the Arts, brought to you by the Arts Management and Technology Lab at Carnegie Mellon University. My name is Victoria Sprouse, the podcast producer, and this is the second half of my interview with Andrew Plumley. If you haven't listened to the first half, be sure to go back and do so. Continuing on with part 2 right now. In an article you wrote for AAM last year, I found a phrase I had never heard before: the 4 I's of oppression: ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. So I'm not going to ask you to explain it all, because as we already said in this podcast, do your own research. But what recommendations do you have for listeners who want to know more about the core theories underpinning these types of oppression and how they might work towards countering them?
Yeah. So I think this is a really helpful and important framework and way to orient yourself to work. And I talk about it in kind of those 4 I's of oppression, or really the 4 stages of kind of any sort of ism or obia. So, and I talked about it a little bit in the time I was with the MAM students, which is really like the personal, interpersonal, organizational, and structural. You can hear it in different forms, but it's always 4 stages. And really at that personal stage, that's where our beliefs, our unconscious bias resides. It's really kind of where things are formed. And just most of the time, society kind of imprints that on us. At the interpersonal level, that's when our biases, our stereotypes, our beliefs and values actually play out with one another. And that's really where we start to get into a little bit of trouble. If my values don't align with yours, or my beliefs don't align with yours, or your stereotype is actually in some way harming me, then we're going to have some issues. So that's where the interpersonal happens. At the organizational level, those biases, those stereotypes, it's the way we do things around here, actually get embedded into practices, policies, and process. And so then all of those things that we actually haven't really deconstructed to know if those are correct or not get baked into organizations. And then at the structural level, that's where all of those biases, stereotypes, prejudice, et cetera, and organizations get kind of mixed up together within systems. So the museum field has its own issues, but we're also, many of us are part of nonprofits or higher ed institutions, or kind of a mix of public and private, or state and local. And those systems are kind of intersecting. And so ultimately, we're also a part of multiple systems. And so those are the 4 levels. And for every museum and museum professional, it's really important that we're doing DEAI work at each level of those stages, but at different paces. So we all need to do work around unconscious bias and understanding our lenses and how we bring our different perspectives to the work. We have to do some work around the interpersonal, about how we actually interact with each other around relationship building and understanding different perspectives. We have to then use those lenses that we learn to deconstruct and unlearn, or to first recognize where there's bias baked into and inequity baked into our organizations and our organizational culture. And then understanding that as a museum field, we're part of specific systems. And so there's inequity baked into those particular systems too. And museums have a responsibility to do DEAI work, particularly equity work, at those 4 levels. And so that's really what those 4 levels of oppression are, or the 4 I's of oppression are talking about.
So today, many museums around the world contain art and artifacts that were stolen from their countries of origin during colonial rule or looted during war. Many American museums contain indigenous artifacts that indigenous people consider stolen. What are some good examples you've seen of museums responding and reacting to their colonial history? And what does decolonization efforts look like in the museum space?
So this is a whole area of study that I'll just say I am not an expert on. Decolonizing museums is a huge field of study, and I believe it's under a large kind of umbrella of equity work, justice work specifically. And what I love about decolonizing is that to me, it really moves into more of a justice space, that because justice to me has to do with repair and looking backwards to see what past harms have been done, to see how we rectify those things in the future. And so to me, it's a critical piece for particularly cultural institutions and museums specifically, because of the particular way that museums were constituted and the particular sorts of harm that museums have done to our own communities. So I think, just generally speaking, DECO is where we should head, particularly for museums that hold objects, but for everybody. And so the way that I think about DECO, and I'm not an expert, there's like two different ways. There's the kind of external in terms of how we think about the narratives we tell and the exhibits that we have. There's kind of like, for the museum audience, sort of decolonizing work that's really about what we put up on our walls or what we show to folks coming into our museums. And then there's the internal decolonizing work, which again is about making sure that we're repairing past harms, that we're letting folks from community, particularly Indigenous folks, who had ancestry of enslaved folks, they're a part of our museum to inform how we actually build a future for our museum. And so it's really trying to move away from white dominant norms and who gets to make specific decisions to allow more folks in that we did harm in the past, in terms of our kind of internal organizational culture, so that we're actually informed by the folks that we've harmed in the past. And so it's kind of internal and external is the way that I think about it. And the museums that do really, really well create relationships with those communities and address and are accountable for past harms that were done. And sometimes that means bringing folks in as board members who can vote, who have decision-making power. Sometimes those are advisory councils. Sometimes that's actually giving particular objects back to those communities and repatriation. I know that repatriation and giving objects back is in some ways very complicated, given the laws and rules of how we even came to be. But ultimately, many of the museums that I work with, all of those objects are stolen. And so if we're not thinking about and not realistic about giving those objects back, we're not really doing all that we can to make those communities in which we took from whole again.
Yeah, that's definitely a larger point that I also can't really speak to, but from the entertainment industry, I've also seen a more centering of Indigenous people working like within the narrative instead of just bringing them on at the end to kind of rubber stamp projects that were already made. So I think you're seeing that in the museum field as well. Definitely something from the last 5 to 10 years, which is crazy to think about. But
it's still relatively new.
Yeah,
at least in the way that it's framed right now. But yeah, it's also it's a means to an end. It's like if you can't have a process that you can't get to decolonizing as an end product if you don't have decolonization or folks who have decolonized their minds within the process to get there. So totally hear you.
So moving back to DEAI work as a whole, I think the importance of it intuitively makes sense when thinking about cultural, historical, and art museums. However, what does DEAI look like in terms of other types of museums like botanical gardens, zoos, and aquariums? The shape that DEAI work takes in the workplace might be similar, but institutionally it has to look a little different, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's super interesting because the frameworks that we can all use remain relatively the same, but the context is really different for those folks, or in some cases. And one way is that I just think about, the way that an art museum might think about climate justice and environmental justice. That's going to be a different sort of conversation, maybe on the periphery. But when you think about zoos, when you think about botanic gardens, and who's actually even working there and who the climate is really affecting the most at what pieces, that is all talking about equity, particularly racial equity in the American context, or generally global equity around the global South and other places. And so they have to think about it from a systems level around climate change and climate justice in ways that maybe art museums don't have to right now. But I think that's like one context where folks are starting to shift to. I also think about, obviously, we were talking about museum leadership being predominantly white, but when we think about botanic gardens, zoos, when we think about STEM, there are historically underrepresented populations, demographic populations within our larger system of museums. And I think when we think about botanic gardens and zoos and aquariums, that is also what we're seeing. A just predominantly white space based on where folks actually study and in terms of the opportunities that folks of color might have in terms of getting into those fields. So there's still absolutely pipeline issues around who can actually become a botanist or work at
a zoologist,
or a zoologist, exactly. So I think there's pipeline issues there, but there are still, I just want to say, there are still qualified applicants across the country that are top notch in any of these fields. But to me, it's the context for kind of how they think about equity internally, given the inequity of how climate change affects folks or animals or issues for their particular focus area. That's how I would think about it.
Yeah, no, that's a really great thing to bring up. I mean, I haven't been to a zoo since I was little, probably, but I know that when I went, who knows, 15, 20 years ago, they definitely weren't centering, a global context. It was more just, look at these animals.
Right, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, you have to think about where these animals are coming from, their relationship to the people that have been there, and then ultimately who's taking care of and watching over those particular animals as well.
So continuing to speak about DEAI work, the A for accessibility is the newest letter in the family of DEI work. What do you see accessibility in terms of disability looking like in museums beyond minimum ADA compliance? And I know that I think accessibility also can relate to economic accessibility, but I did kind of want to center here on more disability accessibility.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the A in the DEAI is often the one that is focused on least, because I think it's the one that particularly for someone like me who is able-bodied, I still take so much of my body for granted. And so until we are kind of living with something different, it's harder for people to get into that mindset. With that being said, there's some really, really great work going on across the museum field around accessibility, particularly intersectional accessibility, where we really are layering in folks that are disabled and also Black or Brown or et cetera. And so just having that intersection is important. One of the things, so when we think about accessibility at AAM and from AAM's perspective, it's really around two things around kind of the disability space. One is actually, can you enter the physical space of a museum? What can we do to make sure that folks of any ability can enter into your space and experience your exhibitions and experience what they're supposed to, given what you're showing? That's one aspect. Another is around kind of what we call neurodiversity, of folks that learn in multiple different ways. What level of access do you have for them? For folks that are on the spectrum, if we need specific tactile things, how is that actually manifesting within your museum? So that's kind of the two ways outside of the economic kind of access that we're talking about that we're thinking about. And obviously entering any building takes a bunch of things. Architects are doing this much better now than they ever have, but it also takes capital to make sure that things are actually accessible. But again, in terms of sustainability for your museum, if you're not even accessible to everybody within your community, then it's not a really sustainable way to move into the future. In terms of, we saw this all with the digital access stuff in 2020 and beyond, making sure that your programs are accessible digitally is a huge piece of this. Particularly, we were doing, AM was doing sessions where we weren't actually transcribing things for folks that were hard of hearing. And so we just had to make sure that we were actually centering those folks and their experience so that they could access the materials, the very good materials that many of us actually put out every day, to make sure that everyone can actually read, hear, and access those things. And I'll just say, with the economic access, that's really important too. If a ticket is $35 for every entry fee, not everyone's going to be able to do that, given the racial wealth gap, given the wealth gap between men and women. So I think it's really crucial to add that economic factor in as well.
I've had such a great time talking to you today. Thank you for being here. And I just have one last question for you.
Yeah.
I know that you are overseeing the Facing Change initiative at AAM, which is working towards advancing museum board diversity and inclusion. What are the top 3 changes you suggest for arts organizations working toward implementing DEAI practices? And I know we've talked about it a little here and there throughout the podcast, but just succinctly at the end here.
Yeah, one is that there's really, just understanding that DEAI work, there's no fixed endpoint. This is an ongoing journey. And because it's an ongoing journey, everyone needs to be involved. And so people, from leadership down to docents to volunteers, anybody, the most junior staffers, everyone needs to see their role in this work. And so that's one thing that I think takes a lot more work than, it's easier said than done. But I think making sure everybody cross-functionally understands their particular role and how it fits into DEAI generally. And tying DEAI to the mission, vision, values of a museum is critical in driving work forward. That's the one thing. The second thing is, I would say that shifting from a diversity and inclusion frame to an equity frame is critical. Equity is a particular sort of work, and it's really about mitigating and ultimately eliminating identity-based disparities within your museum and within your community. And so that is a really particular thing. It's eliminating and mitigating identity-based disparity. Instead of saying we need to do a fellowship or we need to create some pipelines for more diverse folks coming into our museum, it's really that equity work that we really need to focus on. And third is, if we're going to do equity work, we have to disaggregate data by identity. So when we're thinking about who's entering our museums, when we're looking at compensation, promotion, hiring, retention, we have to make sure that we have data based on identity so that we can get some longitudinal outcomes data or data that we track over a period of time to get some baseline data and then see if we're actually mitigating disparity in anything that we're measuring. So those are the 3 things that I would say.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
This is a great conversation. Yeah, and something that I really didn't know a lot about until I went to your lecture and today too. So
thank you so much, Victoria. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Tech in the Arts. We'll be taking a short summer break here at AMP Lab, but new episodes will be coming to you very soon. Be on the lookout. If you found this episode informative, educational, or inspirational, send this to another arts aficionado in your life. You can let us know what you thought by visiting our website, amped-lab.org. That's amt-lab.org. Or you can email us at ampedlabcmu@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter at Tech in the Arts, or on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Arts Management and Technology Lab. We'll see you for the next episode.